I'm really happy to be here because I speak all over the country, and I can speak to a group of 40 people, and I can look at them and think, what could those 40 people do to make this a better world if they really put their efforts to it? And I can think of all sorts of things that they could do, and together, have a huge impact. But then when you go to 2,500 people, that's a whole other level. And I look out here and I think, okay, supposing that, all of you together decided that you were just gonna, many, many things on your plates and many challenges, but as a significant part of what you were gonna do in your 4 years here or your 1 year remaining or whatever in between, that you were gonna say, how am I gonna get the skills, how am I gonna get the experiences to come out of here and start working now and continue working through my life so that, if I look back at, say, 100 years later or 90 years later or whatever it is, I can say, yeah, I passed on something better. I passed on something that's made this a world that's a more generous place for everyone, that's made it more environmentally sustainable, that's made it more just. And so I would argue that that I would hope that today might be, I wouldn't say a beginning point, because I've even already had some conversations. I know that lots of you are already on that journey to begin with, but that today could be a useful point in creating that, a useful point where you say, yeah, this was helpful, and it's given me a few things to be able to think about what I can do as an individual and together with everybody else. And so that's the goal. And obviously, we face a lot of challenges. I don't need to tell you folks that. Look at the economy, the difficulties of just financing your way through school, the debt that many students come out with. It's real. It's serious. At the point that I was going to school 30 or 40 years ago, students really just didn't encounter the same level. There were more jobs out there. If you went through undergraduate, you basically, and worked, say, 20 hours a week as I did, you could do it and not come out with debt. Different world, more challenging in some ways. You look at something like climate change, I'll talk about it more later, but just think about this last year. And the whipsaw, and you've got the runaway fires in Colorado, and you've got the droughts throughout the Midwest and the corn crop dying, and you've got hailstorms, and you've got floods, and it starts to look like the biblical plagues after a while. It is a serious challenge that we're facing, and the more that you can be part of that, the better we're going to be able to succeed in surmounting it. So I could go on and on, but lots of issues out there. Obviously, it's a presidential election, and even if Illinois may not be close, you can go across the river and volunteer for a candidate in a state which is exceedingly close, which is Iowa. So lots of ways to have an impact. Now, a lot of times when I'm talking with people and I'm asking them, well, are you involved in anything in a larger way? They'll basically get caught in a trap. And the trap, the phrase that I came to use was the perfect standard. Because what they would say is, well, I just don't know enough. Or, I'm not in the right place in my life. Or, I'm not the most together person. There would be a long list of things, but they would all be about not measuring up. And I'm a runner, so I tend to think in track and field metaphors. And so the image I got was a high jump bar. And however high you can jump, because oftentimes these students were non-students as well, perfectly knowledgeable about the issues, or some issue at least that they cared about. So it wasn't that they didn't care, and it wasn't that they didn't know anything. It was that they had this standard where however high they could jump, the bar would just be a little higher. And then maybe they'd learn more about an issue, the bar would get a little higher still, and they'd just, here they are, here's the bar, guess I can't try it. And what I came to realize is that, and this is why I call it a perfect standard, is that no matter how much they actually cared about something, or how much they knew about it, they would never give themselves permission to act on it because they always felt like they couldn't measure up, that they had to do had to know every single answer to every possible question, every 17th decimal point statistic. Or they had to be as eloquent as King and saintly as Gandhi or Mother Teresa. Or they had to be, who was a candidate they were thinking of supporting, they had to agree with them on 27 different issues, and if 2 of the 27 they disagreed, they couldn't volunteer. If it was the right place in their life, maybe after I graduate. And I really realized just this is not how it actually works for most people, even the giants of history. I'll give you an example. There's a story that Gandhi's grandson, Arun Gandhi, who's a wonderful speaker, by the way, well worth bringing in, told at a conference that I happened to be at. And he was describing his grandfather, Gandhi, and he said that Gandhi's family basically mortgaged everything they had to send him to law school. So they borrowed on their land, they borrowed on their jewelry, they borrowed on anything they had of value, and he was their shining hope. And he got through law school. And then he got up to practice, his first couple of times in court. And he, the phrase tongue-tied. He was literally tongue-tied. He could not get a sentence out. And so he stumbles and he stumbles and he stammers and he stammers. He cannot get a sentence out, and, somebody want to just shout out what happens if you don't, if you're a lawyer defending advocating for a client and you can't say a sentence out, what will happen? Anybody want to guess? You lose. Exactly. You lose. And, you can't speak up for your client, you're going to lose. So, okay, maybe that was first-time nerves. So, a few weeks later, whenever else it was, gets up again. Same thing happens. Can't get out a sentence. So what happens? And you lose. Again. Third time, fourth time. At this point, it's beginning to seem like a pattern. And they're looking at this young man, his family's vested all their hopes in him. And he's just clearly going to be a failure. I mean, there's just no question that this guy is not going to amount to anything in his life. And, what a shame. They didn't know what to do. So they finally send him off to South Africa, and he literally and metaphorically gets his voice in what they call, in the struggle against what they call the apartheid. And the reason that and then later comes back to India, and we at least know some of the rest of the story. The reason that I love that example is that if you stack it up to the perfect standard, who is the most shy person you could imagine cannot get a sentence out? Well, Gandhi is, and look where he ended up. So when a student says to me, or anybody, I'm kind of shy, I say, well, yeah, I know, that makes it a little bit harder. Definitely, if you're outgoing, it's a little easier to get involved. But compared to Gandhi, you're the most eloquent person in the world, and confident. And so to me, it's just kind of a nice story that embodies the fact that you don't have to start with perfect confidence, perfect skill, perfect certainty. You can still end up making a difference, because obviously he did. And, excuse me, when you unpack the people, who we know of historically, we discover that the same thing is true. That they're not suddenly born out of nowhere, absolutely confident, certain. They kind of grow into involvement. So I always use the story of Rosa Parks, which I used to lead off my Sullivan Citizen book. And we have this image about Parks, and it came to me one day. I was being interviewed on CNN, and Parks was coming in on a remote feed from Detroit, where she lived. So I didn't get to meet her, which would just been an amazing lifetime experience, but we're sort of patched together digitally. And they introduced her by saying, one day Rosa Parks is riding on the bus, and she refuses to move to the back of the bus, and that starts the civil rights movement. And I get really upset. And I can't say anything because my interview's already passed. I'm just sitting there in the studio watching the monitor. But, anyone have a guess as to why I got upset? Again, just shout out.
It started way before that.
It started way before that, precisely so. Exactly. So it started, it didn't start the movement. She was already part of an existing movement. And in fact, she had been the secretary of the NAACP for most of her 12 years of involvement in that organization in Montgomery, Alabama, where she lived. So she was part of this small group of people trying to make change, and you did not have the network news cameras zeroing in and saying, all right, folks, Rosa Parks is making history. She is calling people up to come to a meeting. But that's still actually part of what makes history. is, if she had not, and all those other people hadn't gotten together that organization that was there to respond after her arrest, then, she would have been carted off to jail and that would have been it. So it didn't start there. And I started thinking about the sort of myths we have about that story, because it's kind of one of it's one of the sort of stories that we enshrine as a key moment in our understanding of how social change happens. And the image was that the lone individual kind of heroically, all on her own on the pedestal, instantly changes history and does it, in her case, kind of accidentally, like her feet hurt or something like that. None of that is true. So there's a whole community that's working with her. For example, there's a guy named E.D. Nixon who was a union organizer, what they called it the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and it was an African-American union who carried the trains. At that point in the mid-50s, trains were still the dominant mode of intercity transportation, and so they carried the suitcases on the trains. And he was the head of the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama. And interestingly, in terms of the sort of, again, the perfect standard, he was the person who got a young Martin Luther King involved. And King started out in Montgomery, I don't know if people know this, with the bus boycott, and he was it was his first ministry out of divinity school. And so when Nixon asked him to get involved, he was very hesitant, and he gave all these excuses. He said, I'm new here in town, people don't really know me, I'm not very experienced. I mean, they were all on some level reasonable, but they were also some level, they were variants of the perfect standard. Because Martin Luther King was making excuses why he couldn't get involved. And Nixon just persisted, and finally King says, okay, Brother Nixon, I'm in. And that was where the world first heard of Martin Luther King, as well as Rosa Parks. So that's part of that essential community. And community doesn't have to be 2,000 people. If you have 3 or 5 good people, there's an amazing amount you can accomplish. Second aspect is what I would call intentionality. And Rosa Parks didn't accidentally decide to not move to the back of the bus. In fact, she'd taken training sessions at a labor and civil rights center called Highlander School, still going in Tennessee, and the summer before her arrest. And in fact, a couple of the youth section of the NAACP had refused to move to the back of the bus, been arrested, and they decided they wanted to wait for somebody a little bit older who was sort of a pillar of the community to make the campaign around, rightly or wrongly. I would say maybe they should have gone ahead. But in any case, she'd been thinking about these things. And the way I frame it is that when we're acting for change, there are sort of 2 key elements. One of them is what I call a leap of faith. And I like the phrase of Jim Wallace, is the editor and founder of the wonderful Christian social justice magazine, Sojourners. And he uses the phrase, he says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. So I like that because, clearly you need a leap of faith to do the impossible. And sometimes when people act, they indeed do the impossible. So that's really key. But right next to it is what I would call intentionality. Intentionality is the practical stuff. What does that mean? It means you look at a situation and you say, okay, who are our allies? What are the obstacles? What are we trying to accomplish? How do we tell our story? How do we get the word out? How do we overcome people's objections? All those practical kinds of things. Now, it doesn't mean that you need to know every possible answer to them, but it does mean you want to think them through. So, to take an example of this project that I happen to be running, we have this huge national project to get students involved in the election, and every week we've got a conference call and we brainstorm and we say, all right, what are all the states doing? How can we help them do it better? What other kinds of things do we want to try? Do we need some new materials? Just practically speaking, we think it through and then we try things, and some of them work and some of them don't. But if we didn't think it through consciously, we clearly wouldn't be as effective as we are. In the same way, on a much grander scale, think about the Arab Spring of, now a year and a half ago. And when those people went into Tahrir Square in Egypt or the equivalent in Tunisia, they obviously had to have a huge leap of faith, because you're going in there confronting a dictatorship that has tortured people, murdered people, jailed them. I mean, you basically, the chance that you could use your life lose your life, end up in jail, be tortured, was a very real and significant possibility. So you needed and even people were saying that Mubarak's not going to fall. I mean, even the U.S. State Department was saying, he may be, a dictator, but he's our dictator. We're probably stuck with him. So, they had to have this huge leap of faith to say, yeah, this actually could change. But it wasn't accidental. They didn't just sort of one day, oh yeah, I guess we're all going to stroll down to Tahrir Square and see what happens. They strategized. They had a Facebook group where they did a lot of brainstorming because they could have they could protect their anonymity the way it was set up, but still talk with each other. They did some earlier vigils. They had a silent vigil along the Nile where, if you're basically having a silent vigil, it's a lot harder for the police to attack you because you're not like chanting slogans or something like that. So they just had, I can't remember, but, tens of thousands of people lined up silently along the Nile. I think they were wearing something, some color or something that was a symbol. And, they just gathered. So they had practice marches. They met, some of them met with the people who, it was a while ago when there was a dictator, Milosevic in Serbia, who got overthrown by a nonviolent revolution. The people from that youth effort that led the way have been training other countries that have had dictatorships. And so they met with those folks. So in other words, it was practical as well as a kind of leap of courage. And the two intertwined. I mean, Nelson Mandela uses the phrase, the multiplication of courage, which I love. The idea is that, one person's courage inspires another. Sometimes you have the multiplication of fear. People are afraid to act or speak out, so one person's timidity inspires the other. But I like the multiplication of courage a lot better. Now, third element, which is, for Rosa Parks, go back to that story, persistence. It took Rosa Parks 12 years from her first NAACP meeting to the stand on the bus. That's a long time. Imagine if she'd given up in year 3 or 5 or 7 or 10, we would never have heard of her. So she had to keep on despite all the setbacks and frustrations. All the other people she worked with had to keep on as well. And that's a lesson that's there in any movement. If you give up, you are not going to prevail. We see it in our project. I mean, I remember that just a couple of weeks ago, we had this wonderful young woman. She's a sophomore at a Catholic school in Minnesota, and she's been working to get some North Dakota schools involved. And she was getting a lot of frustration. Basically she was having a hard time just getting through to the people. They wouldn't necessarily return her calls. So I just said, you just got to keep going, you got to keep trying. And then at one point she came back on our conference call and she was just really excited. She said, I've had this great experience. She said, I got through, North Dakota has 5 Native American tribal colleges. She said, I got through to somebody at the tribal college and they were really excited, they're really into our project, and they're going to talk and connect me with the people at the 4 other tribal colleges, and then we're going to try and get the students there to go back to their home communities and get them turning out in the election. And I was just so happy, because what a great example. And this is literally, I think, 2 weeks ago. Here we are, she's persisting, she's getting a little bit downhearted because she's not getting the response that she hoped for. And then, boom, all of a sudden, one of the many things that she does pays off, and then that gave her energy to keep going with some of the other schools who eventually also came around. But it was just a great example of how persistence matters. So again, whether we're talking about 12 years or just here's this project you're doing over the next month or 6 weeks or this next year, you got to persist and keep going. A lot of times, I think people don't really know those stories because we don't teach them. I asked a student once, very smart student, it's from West Virginia, and I said, well, what do you learn about any of the movements that have changed America for the better? What do you know about the abolitionist movement that ended slavery, or the women's suffrage movement that got the vote, or the populist movements of the farmers, or the union movements, or the civil rights movement, or any of those? And he thought about it, he said, to be honest, not very much. We're just not taught it. He says, I think about what I learned in high school. I learned that Lincoln freed the slaves and women got the vote and some unions were organized, and Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, and people cheered him on. But he said, I don't really know how any of that happened. like, what did it take for those people in these really difficult situations? What did it take for them to prevail? He said, honestly, I just don't have an idea. And he says, we're taught the conclusions, we're not taught the process. And if I knew the process, it would just be a lot easier for me to be able to act on the issues that I care about. So that was an interesting lesson, is that I think the more we can learn the process, the more we can transfer. Well, again, it's Mandela's phrase about the multiplication of courage. You can take a story from somebody in South Africa and apply it to somebody working on climate change here, or somebody working for, equitable justice in terms of student loans, and there's a big ongoing fight. If you come out and you say you end up working in a job that doesn't pay very much and you've got these massive loans, should you eventually, because you're doing public service, eventually get them forgiven? Or if you just don't get a job versus somebody who gets lucky and they're making, 60, 80, 100,000 a year and they can afford to pay their loan backs. It's an issue to be debated. I would go on the side of, if you do public service eventually, then your loan should get, forgiven. Or if you just have no income, eventually they should get forgiven. But in any case, you say you're working on that, well, maybe it'll take a while. You just have to keep going. Now, the other thing that's, to me, very important to recognize, when people get involved, you don't know where they're going to end up. And to me, this is very powerful. So, a couple examples. Think about Rosa Parks. How did she get involved? Well, we know actually that her husband, Raymond Parks, was a barber in Montgomery, Alabama, who helped co-found the local NAACP chapter. So when he and Rosa then later got together, it was really easy for her to get involved because he already was. What we don't know, however, at least not in anything I've ever seen, is, well, how did Raymond Parks get involved? We just don't know that. And what I would say is that it inevitably, and I don't know the story because I'm guessing, but there had to be some conversations. Maybe they were at a barber shop. Oftentimes people talk there. And people had to be talking about, well, how do we challenge this situation? And they're saying, yeah, but if we do, we could end up hung by the neck from a tree or dead in a river. The stakes and risks were huge there. But somehow they gave each other the courage to step forward. But we don't know their names. And yet I would argue that maybe if you didn't have those people whose names we'll never know, maybe you don't have Raymond Parks getting involved or starting that NAACP chapter. And if you don't have Raymond Parks getting involved, maybe you don't have Rosa getting involved. And if you don't have Rosa getting involved, you don't have that stand on the bus. And so in a way, you could argue that those people whose names we're never going to know played just as an important role, or almost as important role, as Rosa Parks. And to me, that's very powerful. Because it says that even if you're not that person who dramatically changes history, maybe somebody that you get involved does. Give you a couple other examples. There's a Nobel Peace Prize winner named Wangari Maathai who died a year ago. And I heard her talk in Seattle once, where I live. And she described being at this small Catholic college in Atchison, Kansas. I couldn't even find Atchison on a map, it was that small. And she said she was a foreign student from Kenya, and she said that the conversations around social justice that she had with the faculty and her fellow students, they just completely opened up her world. And she went back to Kenya, and she started what they called the Green Belt movement, where they're planting trees. And some of the trees were planted on land belonging to the cronies of the dictator, and so that brought them in conflict with the dictator, and she ended up in and out of prison, was a major leader in their democracy movement, ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But she said, if it weren't for those conversations, I never maybe would have gone on that path. So imagine if you've got a future Nobel Peace Prize winner sitting next to you, but only if you get him involved. To me, that'd be pretty powerful. Give you another example. Someone I write about in Soul of a Citizen, which actually, if folks are interested afterwards, there's the book, I slide my price for poor students, if you're interested. So a young woman I interviewed for, named Angie DeSoto, who was a freshman in 2004 at Virginia Tech. And at one point in her conversation, I guess to say that she started out not very politically engaged is probably an understatement. At one point, I asked her, 2004 was a pretty close election, and Virginia was a very closely contested state. And so I just was curious. I said, were you involved in it at all? And she got kind of embarrassed. And she said, well, to be honest, I didn't think who was president affected me at all, so I didn't vote. And then she got even more embarrassed. And she said, well, actually we did a drinking game. We divided into random red teams and blue teams. And when a state went red, that is Republican, the red team chugged a beer. And when a state went blue, that is Democrat, the blue team chugged a beer. And as you know, there are 50 states. That's a lot of beer. By the end of the evening, they don't even know who's running for office. They may not remember their own name. It's that bad. And she said, that was where I started. She was kind of embarrassed about it. It wasn't exactly a moment she was looking back on proudly. But the good thing was, that wasn't where she stayed. And what happened was almost, I guess you'd call it almost accidental. She was sitting in this large, maybe 300 or 400 person geology class. And the professor took a risk. And the risk he took was to talk about climate change. And climate change is fairly tangential to geology. I mean, other than understanding how the scientists gather ice core samples, it really is at the periphery. I mean, physics, chemistry, biology, any of the other earth sciences, much closer ties. But he said, this is not about the test. It's not about the syllabus. It's about your lives and the world you're going to inherit. And so he just took them through, and I don't know how closely you followed it, but it's real and it's urgent. If you look at the scientific consensus, every single major international scientific body is just terrified about things. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the US Academy of Science, British, French, German, Japanese, Brazilian, Argentinian, Ugandan, I mean, it doesn't matter. Every scientific body is like, this is real, folks. We had better deal with it. Every major American scientific body, I mean, the American Chemical Society, American Statistical Society, American Geophysical, American Meteorological, I mean, every single one of those is like, this is real, folks. However, some people think, it's still being debated out. Why? Because there's this tiny group of scientists, when I say tiny, maybe 20, who Exxon and the coal companies and these people called the Koch brothers that run a lot of oil and gas stuff have basically funded to say, oh no, they're still deciding, they're still debating this, the jury's still out. Interestingly enough, there's a book called Merchants of Doubt that a science historian wrote, where she traces it and discovers that, oddly enough, this same group of scientists said the same thing about the links between tobacco and cancer, paid for by the tobacco industry. And they said the same thing about the ozone hole, and they said the same thing about the reservations that are being raised on the Missiles in Space Star Wars program. And basically, and they use the same PR firms. That this argument that they've made it a bunch of times, and it's essentially an argument that says, don't do anything. Well, I don't think we can afford that. I mean, again, if you talk about what has been happening in the world, I mean, for the last few years, we're the hottest decade ever since they're recording. Floods going off the charts. I mean, I was in Thailand a few years ago and then was reading and following online, something like a fifth of the country was flooded. Pakistan, we worry about Islamic terrorism. I mean, serious issues of, dispossessed populations turning their ire against us. Well, if you flood a quarter or a fifth of the country of Pakistan, as occurred a few years ago, that is not going to make matters better. All it's going to do is make people more desperate. So, this is a serious issue. It's not that there are things we can do. I mean, I live in cloudy Seattle. My house is heated by, gets its electricity by solar panels that basically cover, the entire amount that we use. I was just talking with somebody here who, actually your dean, who basically came from University of Minnesota Morris, where they've got a wind turbine that powers as much as they use on the campus. I mean, even with existing technologies, let alone the ones that are just, just over the horizon, if we deploy as much wind as we're capable of deploying, we really could cover, all of our electrical needs. If, we could do it. We just don't make the choice to do it. But at this point, North Dakota, I think it's up to 20% of their power is from wind turbines. 10 years ago, it was like 1 or 2%. I mean, just zoom like that. So there's stuff that we can do. We just have to, be able to simultaneously put our minds to it, invest in it, make it cost effective by subsidizing enough to get it off the ground, and then say to the people with the coal companies and oil companies, first we're going to maybe pull some of your subsidies. Oil companies massively profitable, and yet we funnel billions of dollars to them every year from the taxpayers. That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, maybe it's a transitional fuel that we need, but we want to put our resources towards what's going to actually shift us. So, those are, people may have different issues about, how do we do it? What's the best way? I mean, to me, I would just put a price on one proposal. You put a price on carbon, any carbon fuel, including stuff that's imported, and then you roll it back to the taxpayers and put some of the money investing in renewables. To me, that's pretty much a no-brainer. If you did that, the market would take care of the rest of it. That would be my favorite proposal, but other people have different ones. What I would say, though, and this is part of what Angie's professor was talking about, is it's something we have to deal with, and it's going to take our concerted effort to deal with it. So Angie's response was, well, she didn't even know it existed. So she was just completely stunned. And she spent the next few months just kind of reading about it and learning about it, took a class. But Virginia Tech's a really big campus. It's 25,000 people, so it's like a small city. And she didn't know how to act. There was an environmental group on campus, but they only had 4 or 5 members, so she didn't even know they existed. And then finally one day she's walking across the quad, and they're doing a petition for what they call green fees, which is the idea of using student fees to make the school more sustainable. And she's just so excited. Finally there's somebody else, there's an ally, it's their community. And so she jumps into it, and it turns out that she's a really good organizer. And she just has an instinct. She spends the summer, I don't know if you know about the student PIRGs, I think there's one in Illinois. They do a lot of consumer environmental issues, and she volunteered with CalPIRG over the summer, knocking on doors. And she said this great thing, which I always remember having to do with persistence, is you knock on 20 doors, 20 people tell you no, and the 21st person says thank you. And that makes it all worthwhile. It's the same thing as the woman with the North Dakota colleges. You keep on until you get the response. So she took that kind of persistence and can-do attitude back to her school and ends up growing the group into the largest student group of any kind, political or not, on the campus. They end up with 1,300 members on their listserv, that's a lot of people. And they do a campus sustainability coalition that even extends as far as the Campus Young Republicans. And they start doing things in the dorms where they have like peer educators on recycling and energy use and competing, like one dorm gets to compete with the other to see who can end up saving the most energy. And they get the university president, who at first won't meet with them when they're just, 5 people because it's a 25-person school and he can't meet with everybody. But when they're 1,300 people, you bet he meets with them. And he put his full backing behind a comprehensive plan to make the physical footprint of the campus as sustainable as possible. And so Angie's on the committee, and some of it's really simple, like they just discovered that a lot of schools in the winter it's just way too hot, in the summer it's too cold, and they just adjust the thermostats and save, in this case, because it's a big campus, about $300,000 a month. They have like many schools, an all-you-can-eat food plan, and they discovered that if you take away trays, keeps the same plan, but take away trays, that the food waste drops by 1/3. I mean, if people are really hungry, they go back for more, no problem. But they don't pile the tray up, I only ate a quarter of it and dump the rest of it. And then they compost the rest. They switch all their light bulbs to high efficiency. They have new building standards. They start phasing out their car fleet. They have a coal plant that supplies the campus. That's going to take a few years, but they start phasing that out. I mean, just all these things. And Angie ends up graduating, and they say, we want to hire this, we want to keep this young woman around. So they hire her to run it, which is what she's doing now. And I love what she says. She says, I'm proof that individuals can change and institutions can change. I started out, I was a drunken party girl. That was who I was. I am not there now. She says, this school was very apolitical, very detached. Now it's becoming engaged. And so I think it's just kind of a great story because it says that no matter where you start, you can end up and you can get people involved and it can matter. Now let me tell you another story, again a climate change one, because you don't always know who's going to respond. There was a guy who I really admire named Rich Cizik, who is the Vice President of Student Affairs Vice President for Governmental Affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals, which is the largest association of the evangelical churches, very conservative body. And so he spent most of his time lobbying on issues like abortion and against gay marriage on a side that I happen to be on the other side of. And then somebody wanted to pull together a conference of evangelical leaders and started talking about climate change. And there was a key British major evangelical leader named Sir James Houghton, who also happened to be a very renowned climate change scientist. And Houghton said to the group, he said, look, this stuff is real, it's urgent, the evangelical community could make a huge difference in it because so far your voices have been silent or sometimes even into denial. And he went through all the science, but he really also kind of put forth a moral challenge. He said, you might just have God's creation in your hands. And it's your choice whether to act on it and to take the risk. And Cizik took it really personally. He himself considered himself a born-again Christian because that was the tradition he came out of. And he said, this was as important as anything since I was born again. And the phrase he used is, he said, it shook my theology to the core. And I really like that phrase because if you describe one's theology as one's relationship with the larger world, cosmos, the unknowable, whatever one calls God, one's spirituality, however you define it. I mean, it doesn't have to be in religious terms, but it's all that we sort of can never completely know, can never completely comprehend. Then I would argue, sort of what goes to the core of our moral being, I would argue that climate change should shake it to the core. I mean, if you're talking about the potential of massive Arctic ice cap melting and desertification and sea levels rising and millions of people being displaced, I mean, that should go to the moral core. So I think it was a very apt statement that had echoes beyond just his particular theology. I mean, I took it personally as well. And so what he did in response was he took key evangelical leaders, like Rick Warren, the guy who did the mega seller, The Purpose-Driven Life, to the Arctic with Harvard climate scientists. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Arctic, but the way the climate change unfolds, you can see the march much more quickly. So the guy, Mark Begich, who's the senator from Alaska, said that he had been mayor of Anchorage, and he spent a lot of time and energy lobbying and getting funds for this state-of-the-art visitor center that looked out on the beautiful glacier that was near Anchorage. Problem was, by the time the center was built, the glacier had receded so far you couldn't even see it. And he said that turned him around. I went on a rafting trip in the Arctic a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, and I started asking the guide, we're going down this river, and I said, this is really weird. So here are these trees, and they're kind of right at the edge of the bank, and it's hollowed out underneath. And it's hollowed out everywhere. Why? What's going on? That seems really weird. And the guide said, well, yeah, it is really weird. He said, what used to be is there was solid permafrost underneath, and so it supported the bank, and that's why the trees grew out as far as they did. But now it's all melted underneath, so they're just out there and gradually collapsing into the river that we're going down. The same way that if you went through the streets of Fairbanks, there are these huge potholes because they put the asphalt over the permafrost, and then it would melt, and then there would be nothing underneath. And so in a way that you can't, as you can see the extreme weather events as they're happening, but you can't witness it on the day-to-day level as closely and easily as you can up there. So that was why he took them to the Arctic. And a lot of them came back and were just really moved and started speaking out. And it's not to say that conservative evangelical community, very different from, say, a church like the LCA, which, early on, I think, had a climate change statement. But the conservative evangelical community, they're slow on this. They're not all there. But has seismic action made a difference? Of course. And a huge difference. And so, to me, that's part of the challenge that we have, is to not write people off, to recognize that whoever we're reaching out to, they just might respond. We don't know. And to keep doing that. And draw them into the stream. There's a friend of mine named Vincent Harding, who's a theologian and historian at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, helped Martin Luther King write his Vietnam speech. They were very close friends. And one of his books in the civil rights movement, it was called There Is a River. And he talked about a river of social justice involvement, that he's a theologian, so he goes back to the biblical prophets, goes forward in the future. Everybody who acts for change is part of that river. And to me, that's pretty powerful. So what we want to do is we want to get people to be back. We want people part of that river. And we want to look upstream, too. I mean, that's important. I remember I was talking once with a student from Stanford who said, very well-meaningly, I've learned so much volunteering in this homeless shelter. I hope my grandchildren get the opportunity to volunteer in the same homeless shelter that I have. And his friend said kind of, gently, that's not what we ought to be hoping for in a country that's rich as, we shouldn't have homeless shelters by the time our grandchildren come around. I look at that and I think it's not that, it was great that he went out to the homeless shelter. It was wonderful. It was wonderful that he was inspired by it. But we also want him to look upstream and say, all right, well, how come people are homeless? And what could we do about it? And address those common choices before it gets to the homeless shelter, as well as volunteering, which then gives you that personal connection and that urgency. So that's important. It's important, as I've mentioned, and we don't really know right now. The polls are maybe opening a little bit. We don't know how close this election is going to be, or over various state races. And here you are. You have kind of a neat opportunity, because you can cross the river and you have a choice of, if you want to volunteer in an election, 2 different states. You can stay in Illinois, go 5 minutes over to Iowa. Presidential race, we know Iowa is close, as I've said. And you volunteer with a campaign that you believe in, and who knows? I remember when it came down to 537 votes in Florida that elected a president in 2000. In 2004, I was knocking on doors in Washington State, where I live, for my governor's candidate. And I got 3 people out to vote that day. And it wasn't because I can be eloquent, but it wasn't because I was eloquent. Basically, one of them forgot it was election day. One of them needed a ride at the polls, and one of them didn't know what to do with an absentee ballot that late. And so anybody else knocking on the same exact 3 doors would have had the same response. And my candidate ended up winning by 133 votes after 3 recounts. Wow, 133 votes. And I did the math, and I thought, you know what? I got 1/50th of it, just on one day of volunteering. I'd been volunteering other days as well. And if 50 other people on my team had stayed home, or 50 people on the other team had gone to turn out their vote, we'd have had a different result, different governor. She got reelected, people liked her, so, but the first time it was close. Minnesota, 2 years ago, I think it was 167 votes for the U.S. Senate race. It almost came down to the guy who voted for Al Franken and then wrote lizard people on his ballot, so they threw it out. You just don't know how close these things going to be. So I would go under the assumption, certainly what I'm going under the assumption, that your vote's going to matter, and that any vote you can get out will matter. And I would jump in and volunteer. I'm not going to tell you who to volunteer for. That's got to be your choice. But, pick the candidate you believe in, and yeah, you can make a difference. I'd probably be going over the border in Iowa, and then if you're in Illinois 2 years ago from now, you'll have a governor's race. 4 years, there'll be a senator's race. That might be close. But, it's always different. There may be some local mayor's race that matters. But don't be afraid to jump in, and don't feel like you need to know everything or agree with every single stand of a candidate. That's never going to happen. So set aside the perfect standard. Take that moment. And then, I guess, let me describe this and then give a couple more stories and wind down. Which is, a lot of times people don't participate in the elections because, well, first they say they don't know enough. And I say, you know what? I mean, you can go to the League of Women Voters website. It will have the stands of the candidates. You can go to the candidate sites. You can, I mean, one of the things that I'm asking schools to do in our project is to just get the voter guides out there from, nonpartisan group. Rock the Vote's about to have one. League of Women Voters has one. And just go down and compare the candidate stands and see which one you prefer. Not that hard to do. And then people say, well, it doesn't matter. Obviously, the numbers can really matter. That's clear. But beyond that, they say, you know what? Money's going to run the show no matter what. So why even bother? What I argue is that we just don't know how we're going to change things if we vote, but then we also keep on acting. I'm going to give you an example from the Civil Rights Movement, which is that Lyndon Johnson was the person who signed the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill, and that was a major step forward. But it almost didn't happen. And it was because, first of all, he was very personally supportive, but politically ambivalent. Right at that point, the Democratic Party was based largely in the South. Not largely, but about half of it was. And he didn't want it to leave. He didn't want to lose it. And so he was trying to put the brakes on the civil rights movement to slow down, even though he personally supported the goals. And people pushed and pushed and pushed. And finally they pushed so hard that he put all of his political skill, all of his political capital online, and he, convinced them, twisted the arms of the senators. He was pretty good at that. Twisted the arm of the representative and pushed it through. And he said to Bill Moyers, who was his press secretary at the time, he said, we've probably lost the South for 2 generations, but it's worth it. And so I would argue that if there's something an issue that you care about and you want candidates to push more strongly on, I mean, global climate change to me is one, Obama finally mentioned it. Romney's been going back and forth, straddling it. They both should have been talking about it. It should have been at the forefront. So how do you make them do that? You keep on pushing. And so the two interact with each other. Had Johnson not been elected, Barry Goldwater, his opponent, was opposed to civil rights bills. So he would not have signed them, he would not have voted for them, he would have vetoed them. So you got to elect the person that matters, but you also have to get out there and push afterwards. It's not like history ends on that Tuesday in November. So that's important. And then let me give you a couple of stories about continuance, and then open it up for some questions. One is that again, if you keep on, you don't know where things are going to happen. I have a friend who lived to be 102 years old, an amazing woman named Hazel Wolf. And she was 11 years old, and she wanted to play basketball, and she had to fight with her principal to get a women's team to play basketball, but she did, and maybe that gave her some confidence, because then she started acting from that point on. And she was a union organizer in her 20s and 30s, helped push through a model retirement system in Washington that became one of the models for Social Security, which helped her later because she never made much money, so she lived off Social Security her last 36 years. Then she became an environmental activist with the Audubon Society, brought union and environmental groups together, and just did always work, always energized, always a great sense of humor. I remember she was down in Central America, and a congressman said very condescendingly to her, "Oh, I hear you're a bird watcher." And she said, "Oh yeah, there's lots of birds in Washington, D.C. that need watching these days." She wasn't intimidated, and her sense of humor was always at the forefront. And I'd ask her how she would keep on, and she would say, "Well, you can't do everything, but you can do what you can, and you can do some more. You can do that your whole life." And she'd talk about going hiking and kayaking, which she did into her 90s. And then she said, got the mischievous smile, and she said, "Then you come back ready to take on Exxon." And I just thought, this is how somebody keeps going. They've got a good sense of humor, they nurture their soul, and they just keep on doing the work as long as they possibly can. The second story comes from Desmond Tutu, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from South Africa. And imagine what it was like to be a black man in South Africa. And you're told you cannot go to this school, this park, this city, this job, this beach, and you got to tell later on you have kids, and you got to tell your kids that too. It tears you apart. I mean, we can't go there. Well, why don't these people like us? And you see your friends imprisoned, tortured, murdered. I mean, it tears you apart. Finally, after this global struggle, including a lot of American students, they get their freedom. And Tutu chairs what they call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the idea was that if you told the story of everything you were involved with in a crime that committed in the name of apartheid, you would get amnesty, you would get forgiven, legally at least. But if you lied, or you held back, or you didn't tell who else was involved, you'd get prosecuted. So it was a strong impulse for people to step forward. And week after week, day after day, month after month, you have these horrendous stories, and everybody is leaning on Desmond Tutu to get him through it. He's the spiritual head of it. And imagine, you would just think after that he would just kind of put his feet up on the rocking chair and retire, and that would be it. But he didn't. So after those horrible massacres in Rwanda where people are literally hacking each other apart with machetes, he's there trying to bring some healing to that scarred land. And he's in Haiti as an election observer, and they're trying to steal the election, and people are rioting in the streets, and they bring the helicopters to fly out the observers for their own safety. And he says, no, I got to stay here with my people. These are my people, I got to be here on the ground with them. And he speaks out passionately against the Iraq War, which he just regarded as a disaster from the start. And he talks about climate change, and he says there's 3 billion reasons to act. The 3 billion poorest people in the world have done nothing to create it. They will bear the brunt of it. We have to act for them. And so you might think from all of this he has just seen too much human blindness and would be bitter or broken down. But the opposite is true. If you ever have the chance to see him, he's not touring that much anymore because he's getting on in age. But I would, it's worth the drive to Chicago or Des Moines or wherever it happens to be. I've seen him 4 times. He almost floats off the stage. It's the only way I can describe it. He is joking, he's laughing, he's talking to people. He is having a really good time. And there was a phrase that he's used all 4 times. He would say at a certain point, he would say, God has a sense of humor. And he would tell a joke, often a kind of silly joke. The one I would remember is he said, who would think that the world would learn anything from South Africa? We're not the brightest country. Our scientists said that they would build a rocket to the sun, and when people pointed out that it would burn up, they said, oh, no, it's fine, we'll launch it at night, it'll be okay, no problem. And I'm sitting there laughing, and then I'm thinking, my sort of sensorial impulse kicks in, But why is he telling this silly joke? And he could be telling another story about Nelson Mandela and the freedom struggle and everything else. And then it dawns on me. He's reminding us to laugh. That is as important as anything else. So he just weaves it in. And I've taken that lesson. The other time was the first time I saw him. It was a benefit in Los Angeles for a South African project. And he was not feeling that well these days. He's been battling prostate cancer for a while. Lay down for a nap, gets up, gives his talk, some other people speak. And then a band starts playing, a really good band from East LA, and people start dancing. And I look over. There is Desmond Tutu, just dancing away, having a great time. And I'm thinking, I have never seen a Nobel Peace Prize winner dance before, much less an archbishop. This is really interesting. And what was the lesson? The lesson that I got is that this is somebody who savors every moment of the grace of the world. So if there is music, well, of course he's going to be dancing to it. And if there's good food, of course he's going to be enjoying it. And jokes and humor and good community and good conversation. And he thinks it is a gift to be here on this earth, that he is blessed for being here on this earth. And that he knows that humans can be callous and blind. He has seen that, and he has dived into the heart again and again of that callousness and blindness to try and change it and turn it. So he is not naive, and he is not starry-eyed, and he is not innocent. But he recognizes still that it is a gift to be here, and that fuels his radical prophetic voice for justice, which is as powerful as any we have seen in our time or any else's. And I would argue, I don't know, maybe there will be the next Desmond Tutu or Rosa Parks or whoever sitting here in this audience. You never know. But at the very least, we can become people who live our lives asking that question, what can we do to make a better world? And we are not going to do it alone. We are going to do it in community. We're going to do it with other good people. We're going to savor that community. And when we do that, we're going to find out 2 things, I would argue. One is the power for change that we have, and 2 is why we are here on this earth. not to be in isolation, not to just get ours, but to work with and for our fellow human beings. Thank you very much.